Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and video show which brings you leadership lessons, knowledge and experience and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you won't miss a new episode. I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Rajinder Jhol. Hey, Rajinder, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you, Fritz. Thank you. Yeah, you call me Raj. It makes
Raj,
it
yes,
easier. Yeah.
Raj, I'm going to introduce you to our audience. You are
Yeah.
born in Singapore, but now reside in Switzerland. And as a digital native, you've worked in various technology startups and has been supporting nations to the transition to genuine democracy since 2009. Something we'll definitely cover in our discussions. You have a background in international diplomacy, governance systems, democratic development. You are also the author of a number of books, Understanding France and the Challenges of the Yellow Vests, and the latest book, Shine, which we'll definitely cover in this program. So again, Raj, very much welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you, Fritz. Yeah.
And
Glad to be here. Yeah.
I very much would like to start off our discussion with how did you get from Singapore to Switzerland? Was that with your parents? Was that a move when you were a grown-up? How did you get there?
Well, I grew up in Singapore and with the heat, with the tropical heat, even as a child, I knew I had to go and live in a cooler country. So as soon as I finished my national service, which is compulsory in Singapore, I took the flight to Europe, spent a year traveling from Finland, the Nordic countries, and then came to Switzerland and studied French, and then at the university to study economics. So yeah.
Yeah. How did your family feel about that? Because did you tell them I'm not going to come back, or was that something you experienced when you were here?
Well, I guess it was like they surely expected me to come back, but year after year, just got more activities on my list, and I literally didn't go back. And I love it to be in Switzerland. The nature is great. I love the country. I love the values the country represents. In terms of democracy building and how citizens are treated here. So I think it's an example for many countries moving ahead, including for Singapore.
Yeah. Okay. Now, as mentioned when I introduced you, as a digital native, you've worked in various technology startups,
Yeah.
which seems more traditional career path, but you've also been supporting nations to the transition in genuine democracy.
Yeah.
Triggers me. What does that mean?
Well, I got involved in the tech industry, I think, in the late, just before 2000. Built some of the first content management system and then information management systems. And some of my first clients were with the government here. I very quickly realized, at first they were, of course, not very excited about technology because, they thought they had the yellow pages. Why do we need the internet? So we had to go through those those phases. But very quickly, they started to see the economic benefits of digitalization.
Yeah.
And what I particularly saw in my experience of having built, for about 15 years, different federal government projects, is that sometimes you build an application that maps the processes of how people work and cooperate. And sometimes you can basically build a technology platform that shapes how people cooperate. So that got me really fascinated. I was very fascinated by, can we create digital systems that actually help to increase efficiency of how people work and operate, So that was my trigger point in terms of how we interact with technology and how we influence technology and how technology influences us. Yeah, with
Oh,
Iceland.
those are big thought. That reminds me of the whole Arab Spring from that period, where we all thought that this is going to be a change for the good.
Yeah,
Technology.
absolutely, absolutely. So I was very involved. So after having, worked for the, provided solutions for the Swiss government at federal level and at state level, when the Tunisian revolution happened, I thought, oh, that would be a great opportunity to build new processes for them,
Mhm.
right? It made sense. So I designed an application which was funded by the Swiss government into Tunisia to help citizens and NGOs participate in the constitution development process. So how could they rewrite their constitution, with more people being involved? Something which was inspired by what happened in Iceland in 2009, 2010. But Iceland had those values built in for almost 1,000 years, while Tunisia had no idea of how to, self-organize so the power structures, the hierarchy structures in Tunisia were very present. And so I thought by building an application that allowed citizens to participate in the democratic process by, reviewing the constitution, participating in what needs to be in the constitution would have been a way to leapfrog. They're just an hour away by flight,
Yeah.
but they are, years behind in terms of, socio-cultural, economic development, in a hyper-globalized world. So this is the same case for most of the North African countries. And actually in 2011, after having, deployed solutions in Tunisia, I worked into Egypt, and then in Ukraine in 2014 in Maidan. Also, and I heard the same comments. I heard the same voices, the same frustrations about how citizens could not engage with the government, how citizens could not have access to better governmental services. And that led me to basically writing the book for France, the future of France, and in light of the Yellow Vest movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
Hold on to that thought. You're jumping the gun here.
Yeah.
I want to backtrack before I go to that book.
Uh-huh.
Is if you're in IT, you know the saying, a fool with a tool is still a fool.
Yeah,
So just getting the technology out
yeah,
there is
yeah,
not enough.
yeah.
Now, when you go, I mean, did you actually go to these countries
Yes.
so what did you bring outside the technology that people would be able to understand how to apply that technology, that app, to actually get it done what you were looking for, what you're aiming for with that tool?
Well, I think in key was the ability to understand the structures of power, how decisions are made, and if there's consensus building involved, if who had the right to participate in building the consensus. So typically in third world countries, I would consider Tunisia and some of the other northern African countries as almost third world, because the idea of how a nation is built is very hierarchical. So
Yeah.
there's one Superman, and Superman makes decisions, and everybody follows those decisions, right? Which is a huge contrast to Switzerland, where decisions are actually made at the local level, the commune, and from the commune into the state, and through the state to the federal level.
Okay, now you just described that's the difference between how it's done in Switzerland with quite a long history, and what you described was the opposite
Yeah,
in the countries just mentioned.
yeah.
But how do you then convince people, if if they've grown up in that culture, that okay, you can do things differently? Um,
Yeah, I mean, culture is not ice block. right? Culture, intermingles, culture, dissolves and evolves, and there is a natural cultural mutation between what people, let's say in Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, what they live and what they see on TV.
Okay.
Right. So you already have a cultural fluidity happening. And the same thing, I guess, in Ukraine. So culturally, they may be, post-Sovietic country from 1994, but the very fact that Ukraine has been wanting to reach out into the West, Western ideas, Western media. So you already start to evolve the culture much broader. So culture can be it's not stagnant. It's a living embodiment of the people and their will and how they access media and information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Now, okay, you just mentioned you want to begin about your book, Understanding France and the Challenges of the Yellow Vests. Maybe to explain to people who about what the Yellow Vest, what what does that represent?
Well, the Yellow Vest movement in France basically represented the anger of people in France in 2000 and well, a couple of years ago, so 2000 and was it 19 or 18, where France decided to increase the carbon tax on fuel without consulting its population, and that small increase of fuel tax made it literally impossible for a lot of the French people to get to work. So that took a huge portion of their budget. So the French people decided to protest against that decision. And what made it common was the yellow vests that they had in the cars. Yeah. So it's one of the protest movements, one of the greater protest movements that we've seen in France for a long time. And France is the birthplace of the modern republic, which was also born out of a revolution against the king. So in light of that, and in light of the other revolutions that have been going on since the Arab Spring, I thought there was a lot of common denominators. So I managed to to capture the common denominators across these different countries in transition, and I adapted it to the case in France, and sort of like explored why this is a real issue, like the lack of social mobility, the loss of trust in government, the disconnection between the cities and the rural states, and the lack of access of services in the rural regions. So these are very common denominators to why social unrest happens. Yeah.
But what was the mandate you gave yourself to write that book? Because what I'm observing is this is a book about the Yellow Vest movement in France. And it's a book written by somebody born in Singapore who lives in Switzerland. What was your mandate?
Well, my mandate was to call upon the French people and say, get your revolution right.
Okay.
You are the creators of the modern republic. The problems that the French have, all republics across the world, they have those same problems. It's about how citizens engage with government.
Okay, so this is not a book written specifically for France, but taking the French example as what you say, the foundation of the modern republic. So look, what's happening in France can happen in other republics as well.
Absolutely, especially in light of the digital world. How we can send money, receive money, we can connect to people around the world at zero cost, but we can't vote from your phone, we can't vote on issues, we can't participate in the consensus building, we can't participate in the political dialogue. So these are natural conflict points, if not addressed neither in France nor anywhere else in the world. There's going to be a clash. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what was the driving mechanism, the driving force to write a book? But that's quite a big effort to sit down and write.
Because I was so emotionally involved, and I had laid so much faith in democracy. I had laid so much faith in the human ability to self-organize, to come together, that I was so emotional. I had to get it out of my system. I had to lay it out, you know, because otherwise I would have just gone crazy, you know. So I saw the limitations. I saw how difficult it is. And I thought that by writing it down, by creating pathways, by shedding light on, you know, alternative futures and how we could use technology to build better nations, build a better republic. You know, it was a healing process for me, myself, and I thought that, you know, that healing process would help some people think of a better, brighter possible future. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I understand now what drives you. But in preparation of this interview, Raj, I've also come across a couple of other initiatives you have done to help create a better world, like, for instance, the International NGO Day.
Mhm.
Maybe you can take the audience a little bit what that initiative was about and what you were trying to do with that.
Well, that International NGO Day was held at the United Nations in Geneva, and it was just after the SDGs, the Agenda 2030 SDGs, had been, you know, deployed, and it was so. And I thought that the SDG framework was a very good framework to build collaborative, to increase collaboration and cooperation. And especially among NGOs who still had to learn what are these frameworks and had to learn the vocabulary. So I invited around 200 different NGOs into the UN, and, you know, and structured their activities with regard to the SDGs to get them to, you know, reevaluate what they were doing with regard to the SDGs and how they could cooperate among NGOs, together with businesses and together with governments, you know, using the same language, you know, like working to end poverty or working to build gender equality or you know, sustainable cities, you know.
Okay.
So it was a information, education, collaboration hub. So to get them to understand on the need to cooperate, you know, especially since, you know, most of their funding most likely comes from you know, similar sources, and so in times of you know, economic and financial constraints, there needs to be, you know, increased cooperation to get the job done. Yeah, yeah. So.
Okay. Now, what did you learn from organizing the International NGO Day?
Well, I learned that cooperation and collaboration is difficult.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Um, Budgets mainly. People have to hunt for budgets and preserve their budgets, build wall around their budgets. They have to, you know, showcase what they're doing with their money, and they don't necessarily know how to cooperate and share the wins. And this is not just at the NGO level. You know, having worked within the UN, I realized it was the same thing within the UN, within each of the silos, and cooperation across UN system organizations, or even within the organization across the silos, is very difficult, often because of budget constraints, how they do their reporting, how they share their outcomes, and, you know, how collaboration, I think it's it's a challenge. You know, I mean, what we see in the microcosm, we see it in the macrocosm, you know, how we collaborate globally for environmental challenges, you know, in the global economy, you know, for global health issues. We've seen with COVID, it's not always easy. There's a lot of mistrust and fear sometimes, and mistrust and fear drives human motivation more than love and collaboration. I mean, this is how we are pre-built, designed.
Are you describing a surviving mechanism in your opinion?
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
I do see
Definitely.
a common thread, a common denominator in all in your background so far. I'm just wondering where do you draw your inspiration from?
Justice, I guess. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Social justice. So, I mean, we're here on Earth for a very short time, right?
Mhm.
We all came with nothing, and we will leave with nothing, empty-handed. So is this world a simulation? How many levels of reality do we have here? Do we get lost in the matrix, or do we create conditions for future generations? So at this point of time, I feel that we are on a rough edge. We haven't really tackled the many sustainable development challenges. Inequality in countries and among countries is still growing.
Mhm.
There's still the haves and the have-nots. And I guess I always felt human before before nation. Um, you know, so that's just where I got my inspiration. I think I would not stop doing what I'm doing until I see genuine progress towards achieving some of the sustainable development goals
Okay,
that we have
so
set.
triggers me to ask you, how would you define success? What's your success? And what are you proud of? What have been your key milestones so far in your career and your life?
I mean, there can be lots of success. I think my greatest success is to be able to stay on track with what I feel, with what inspires me. I think despite the challenges, I've had financial success, building innovative tech solutions. I've had uh, emotional success, in many NGO activities, um, and I feel personal success, having being able to write a novel, to having planted a few seeds to contribute to advancing the republic and democracy in the world. you know um it's I you know as I rather not look at success in terms of outcomes, but rather just being able to continue to do what I'm doing, like Picasso, or he would keep on creating his work. He can't stop and say, well, this is my masterpiece, and he has just to keep going on. So it's something else that fuels him and fuels the human spirit.
Yeah.
And so if I am able to continue to live my human spirit without constraint, and manage the difficulties, but yet continue to plant the seeds in the garden I wish to see, then that's the success. And then the joy would be when the flowers blossom and the fruits are edible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, now, Raj, you just briefly showed us you could say, a copy of, I would assume, one of your milestones, the
Mhm.
book Shine. It's actually quite a thick book.
Yeah,
Maybe you could
yeah.
show it again briefly.
Yeah, it's 480 pages.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's written in the text is I think 12.
yeah.
Um, and
Okay. No,
I don't
we
know.
can't
Oh, you
see that.
can't
That's
see,
fine.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
so we're going to finish this discussion about this book, Shine. First of all, why the title Shine? What do you want? What message you want to convey by calling your book Shine?
Well, I think the key message is how can we shine from within? And there's a lot of shine and stimuli that's coming from the outside world. And living in the digital age, there's a lot of light coming from the outside world.
Okay.
But how can we connect with an inner light?
Okay.
And I think that we are at that point in history that if we are not able to reconnect with our humanity and what makes us human, I think we'll just be fully immersed in the technological world, and we might be unable to reconnect because of the knowledge bias that we are immersed in,
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, can you give us a synopsis? What is this book about? Is this a novel? Is this nonfiction? What is this?
Yeah, so it's a novel.
Okay.
What one could say it's a spiritual novel. And there's a lot of aspects of nonfiction because it's basically the journey of a man who is very concerned about the state of the world, the state of his own feelings, his relationships, how does he see his future, and he doesn't see a future. Most people would then pray to God and hope for the light of God to give them inspiration. But in this case, this man decides to understand why we're not thriving. So he decides to look into the darkness to see why we are not the best that we could be. So what lessons could be learned? So he meets with the devil to discuss this. And the devil tells him lots of different things, like he's humorous and smart and funny, and tells him that he's controlled 99% of humanity through its political, economical, social, cultural systems, and that human beings right now at the dawn of the technological age might soon be in a state where they might no longer be able to have free will and think. So that becomes the challenge. So the devil speaks about how he controls the human mind, the human perceptions, the belief systems, by always let's say attempting to capture the human imagination so that the human imagination will not thrive. So the conflict became between the outer shine and the inner shine. So I call this book Shine because it's a call for an inner shine, so that we create the world we want to see, that we, the world we dream of, rather than being imposed by the structural elements of our contemporary society, and to be enslaved or fit in there. So it's a radical call to reconnect with the self through the use of myths, and myths are very important.
Now, in this book, do you provide solutions, or do you I'll say, ask questions for people to think about?
Exactly. So I don't think we are in a state of a world where we lack solutions. We don't have a problem with solutions. Technology is there. Financing is there. We have challenges about our humanity, about who we are as human beings, and how do we collaborate? How do we see the other as ourselves? How do we see, how do we deal with unchecked power, for example? How do we understand the corrupting influence of power? And what are the dangers of seeking power for its own sake, and how are the responsibilities, and what accountability should be? So we are we have, as human beings, I think we have to do some inner engineering right now in order to reevaluate new pathways for a sustainable society.
Okay.
At a both at national and also at planetary level. So how do you teach wisdom? How do you share wisdom? So we live in a world, hyper data, hyper information, hyper knowledge, almost close to zero wisdom. And so in an ever increasing data-driven world, how do we understand the challenges of storytelling, of narrative building? How do we develop critical thinking around those aspects? So I think these are the challenges that we face today, in terms of building the creative out-of-the-box solutions that we need to move on at local or national levels.
And how much of this book is pure fiction, and how much is it based on personal experience in what you describe, what you've done for Tunisia and other countries around the world?
Well, I think that would be a very good question for any author, right? So I guess I am limited by my own imagination and my own experience. So the book is a product of my imagination and my experience. So naturally, that sort of like limits to the power of the book. Yeah, I guess that's all I can say on that.
Okay. Now, outside the recommendation, read your book. What is the advice you would like to give to the people listening to this? Look, hey, independent where you are, this is what I would do if I were you. What's your takeaway there?
Well, I guess independent of where we are on Earth, we need to take a step back.
Yeah.
Just a step back within and look at ourselves and how we're operating into the world, how we're operating into reality. Take a step back and understand the nature of truth. Especially, given that we might be living in a post-truth world. How do we understand what is a fact?
Mm-hmm.
How do we develop and renew ethics and morals moving forward in an AI-driven society? So I think if we are unable to take a step back, we'll just be fully immersed and we'll get taken in by the wave, and and we might drown in the ocean of knowledge. So I think taking that step back is what my book offers as a unique experience. So instead of smashing your head against the wall and repeating the same kind of mistakes and prejudice and biases that we have, that doesn't allow us to have clarity or thought and purpose, perhaps reading a book around the difficulties and challenges of having clarity and single-minded purposes and understanding the biases within which we live could help us, win that clarity which we need. So we need to shine from within. So that's my little play of storytelling with nation building and hopefully that we can collectively light up the world. Yeah, that's in a
Hey,
nutshell.
Raj, there's so many questions I'd like to ask about your thoughts and ideas on that book, but I'd say I would recommend also the audience read the book. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, background, where you came from. And let's take a step back and observe what's happening. And I think that's very good advice for anybody out there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fritz. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the brand called You Videocast and Podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.